lectures. And as the first speaker, I would like to invite Dr. Visala from University of Helsinki, Finland. With a paper, can an experience be generally religious if it's caused by mental or brain disorder? The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you, Sasha, for the invitation. It's good to see all of you here. So what I'm going to do next is just to I will just give a brief overview of what I say in the paper, and I'll try to keep it short, and you can read all the details in the paper itself. The funny thing was that when I started writing this paper, this wasn't the conclusion. I ended up with a conclusion when I wrote the paper, but it was completely opposite to the conclusion that I was planning to make. So I ended up changing my mind on this when I was writing the paper, and I'm trying to explain why I did change my mind. So, first of all, one has to be really specific about the question that this paper of mine is trying to answer. And the exact question is the first one. So notice the if here. If a religious experience is constituted by or partly caused by a mental disorder, is it plausible to construe that experience as a genuine religious experience? My answer to the question is no. And that's what I'm going to argue in this paper. And the second question is, does it make a difference with respect to question number one, if mental disorders are constituted by or partly caused by brain dysfunctions? And the answer to that, in my view, is no as well. So when I started working on this paper, my idea was that the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is yes as well. So I ended up changing my mind. So, basic terms, what I mean by genuine religious experience is an experience that has a potential that is a potential source of knowledge in a religious community, and it grounds beliefs about the divine in one way or the other. So you might have all sorts of religious experiences, but what I call a genuine one is the kind of experience that has a potential to ground beliefs about the object of the experience. In this context, God or some divine whatever. And in the Christian tradition, I think it's quite generally acknowledged that there might be religious experiences and apparent religious experiences that are actually pathological and that have their sources in some sort of pathology, thereby disqualifying them as sources of knowledge. So a lot of mystical theologians really wrestle with this question, so they try to distinguish between experiences that have problematic sources, like melancholia or something like that, and distinguish them from genuine religious experiences. So this seems to be a theme that comes up in a lot of classical texts on these matters. And with respect to mental disorder, again, it's quite important. So what is a mental disorder? The standard definition includes two components, a functional one and a normative one. So I'm going forward with that basic standard definition. One way to solve these problems that I'm going to present is to give up this standard definition. So there's the normative part. There's something that's causing distress, suffering, and disability, which is measured in terms of psychological description, psychological experience, things like that. That's normative, because it depends on the environment, depends on the individual, it depends on the experience of the individual. But then there's the functional bit, which is some sort of underlying mental or brain system that is not functioning properly. The idea being that you can define this dysfunctional bit in terms of in terms that are at least to some extent distinct from the normative side. And basically, the argument that I present in the paper goes something like this. So we all agree, I think, or that we should agree, that whenever a religious experience or a genuine religious experience is going on, there are some natural, cognitive, neural, whatever mechanisms involved. So those are in play. If we put that assumption in, then we get an argument along these lines. First, in order to be a genuine religious experience, the experience is plausibly causally connected to a religious source. This is premise number one. Premise two, if an experience is plausibly caused by a mental disorder, it's artificial, contrived, or unreasonable to hold that it's causally connected to a religious source. And therefore, an experience that is caused by a mental disorder should not be considered as a genuine religious experience. And the reason, the reasons that I give for premise two, which is the crucial premise there, is that we have, I think, in our disposal ways to define mental dysfunction or brain dysfunctions in a sense that can be reasonably objectively defined. So we know when a psychological system is functioning well and when it's not functioning well. And it's not just the fact that it's producing a certain kind of belief. So we can have situations where people have lots of false beliefs, but there's no mental dysfunction going on. So we don't infer the dysfunctionality of the system just based on the beliefs that it produces. So even if we think that all religious beliefs are false, that doesn't mean that the systems that produce those beliefs are dysfunctional. So we have other ways of finding out why it's the case that in standard mental disorders like depression or schizophrenia, there's some underlying dysfunction in the system, not just the fact that they are producing false beliefs. And also in these kind of box standard examples that I gave in depression and schizophrenia, the mental dysfunction in question impacts the epistemic function of those mechanisms. So it's clearly an epistemic dysfunction that's going on there. That is, the system is producing unreliable. The system is unreliable, so it's producing false beliefs. So if this holds, then it seems to me that if you have a religious experience and then it turns out that it's caused by a mental disorder, then it disqualifies it from being a genuine one, because there's some sort of epistemic dysfunction going on in the system. That's the basic argument. A couple of objections to this argument. The first objection is that, as I already said, one could say that perhaps the definition of dysfunction here is somehow naturalistic. So a religious person or a religious believer need not accept this. So, for instance, they could say, well, the dysfunction is defined in terms of false belief output. And they're saying that, well, because the system is producing a religious belief, and we know that all religious beliefs are false, this shows or demonstrates that the system is dysfunctional. That's objection number one. And the objection number two is that perhaps God is working through dysfunctional means. So God is intentionally, voluntarily creating and communicating with people using dysfunctional mental mechanisms. This raises a more general question of how to define function in this case. And there are many different ways of defining functionality. There's a more evolutionary account saying that a mental mechanism or a brain mechanism has a specific function because it's evolved to perform a certain function. This way of defining functionality is quite problematic in my way of thinking. I don't think this will work. First of all, because it's difficult to find out what the evolved function is. And second of all, there might be several, or there might not be an original function, because the functionality depends on the context so much. So I'm not too hot on that solution. But a broader account of function is that a system is functional when it contributes to the functioning of a broader system. And I think we can define this dysfunctionality in many mental disorders, like depression and schizophrenia, rather neutrally. Because we can see, for instance, in depression, a lot of cognitive dysfunctions. We can see that the reasoning processes of depressed people tend to be biased, and we can see this bias. This bias can be measured in multiple ways. It can be measured in how depressed people's memories work, how their attention works, how their reasoning works, and we can see that, and we can measure it without having to assume first that the beliefs that the system produces are false. So I think the first objection is not very plausible. And one of the background assumptions that I'm making here is that if we have a mechanism that is unreliable epistemically in the secular domain, it's also unreliable in the religious domain. So one way to get rid of this argument is to say, well, you might have a psychological system like perception in certain circumstances that is actually unreliable in the secular domain, but it actually works in the religious domain. Which is, I think it's extremely weird. It would be weird to find out that I feel shame in a way that's ungrounded in a secular context, but when I feel shame in a religious context and the same mechanism is driving it is somehow functional, well, then it's not functional in the other context. So it seems to me that the dysfunction from one context to another, if it's dysfunctional in one, in the epistemic sense, it's dysfunctional in the other. And the reason why I'm not too keen on the second objection to the argument is because of theological considerations. So, if it's really the case that God causes us to have certain kinds of knowledge about Himself through mechanisms that are dysfunctional, just seems extremely weird. So one of the reasons why it seems weird is that if mental dysfunctions are means for divine communication, then we can infer that God causes moral and epistemic evils. And this seems like a weird theological assumption. And also it seems that God would want to do something else. God would want to support both moral and spiritual flourishing, that is, functioning mental mechanisms, not dysfunctioning ones. So someone might say that perhaps, there's the idea that religious experiences are somehow disturbing, and because they're disturbing, like the dark night of the soul or various aspects of it and various other kinds of experiences, the disturbing aspect of it is understandable, and that introduces a dysfunction in the system. In the mental systems. But again, it seems to me kind of weird to say something like this, because if you were to say that, then you say, well, God communicates with people through dysfunctional means. And then I would make the distinction between suffering, felt suffering, and then dysfunctionality at the mental level. So it might be the case that some religious experiences cause suffering. But that doesn't mean that the underlying systems are dysfunctional. It actually means that they are functional because you're responding to something that's coming in, like you're responding to the fact that you're a bad person or something like that. And that doesn't mean that the underlying psychological system is dysfunctional. It means that it's functional. So I would then say that these traditional religious experiences that have been associated with suffering or some sort of disturbance, they don't count as somehow revealing the fact that God communicates with humans through dysfunctional mechanisms. So, options. If you want to avoid the argument, there are a couple of moves to be made. First one is to deny the realist assumption. The realist being that there is a functional bit in mental disorder. You say, well, no, mental dysfunction, mental disorder doesn't doesn't necessarily include any kind of dysfunction. It's just normative. So mental disorder is what we decided to be, what the cultural norms and so on decided. So that's one assumption. I don't think that's very plausible, but there are accounts of mental disorders that go along these lines. There's the denial of the value assumption. You could say that yes, God can commit evils and God is actually doing things like that. That's one assumption. And there's the third assumption, to deny the idea that there is a shared mechanisms, a shared set of mechanisms with religious experiences and other experiences. Like you could say that religious experiences have some sort of special mental or neural mechanisms that are not affected by mental disorders, they are affected by something else. But I think this is empirically and also theologically quite problematic for a number of reasons that I don't have time to go into. So what's left, basically, I don't want to say that if it turns out that a religious experience is not genuine, that it's somehow useless. So that's not really the case. So you might have religious experiences that are due to mental disorders, and they might have some religious impact. They might be useful, or they might be constructive in the sense that you learn something about the vulnerability of humans or whatever through those experiences. But you certainly won't learn anything about the divine through those experiences, because they are not trustworthy sources of the divine, knowledge of the divine. Okay, so I did have something to say about the relationship between brain dysfunctions and mental dysfunctions, but I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.